Hello and welcome to the Theology Mill podcast brought to you by Whitfinstock Publishers. My name is Zach Mickle from Whitfinstock. I'm the host of this podcast, which consists of interviews with leading authors and thinkers in theology, biblical studies, and philosophy. So in this episode, I get the privilege of talking with Dr. Philip John Paul Gonzales, who is an associate professor of philosophy at St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore. He's the author of the book Reimagining the Analogia Entis, the future of Erich Przywara's Christian vision. He's also the editor of a couple of volumes with Cascade, including one entitled Exorcising Philosophical Modernity, Cyril O'Regan and Christian Discourse After Modernity, as well as co-editor of Finitude's Wounded Praise, Responses to Jean-Louis Chrétien. And that last book is the one we'll be discussing in detail here in this episode, and just talking about Chrétien more generally as well. Before we get to the interview, I do want to also mention our kind of new and improved Theology Mill newsletter. So we'll be sending that out to email subscribers on a monthly basis. Well, we've been sending it out, but it's been kind of new and improved in the last couple of months. So if you subscribe to that newsletter, by the way, we will send you a 40% off single-use coupon code that you can use on one or any number of Whitfinstock titles. So be sure to check the link to the subscription form in the show notes below, and then make sure that you check the box next to podcast updates near the bottom of that form before you subscribe. That newsletter is going to feature regular book deals and give you kind of a bit of behind-the-scenes look at the podcast. So this April and May, for instance, of 2025, we're offering a free PDF version of any single Whitfinstock book for anyone who rates the show on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and then sends us proof. So the details for that offer and for future offers will be within those newsletters. So be sure to subscribe at the link below. And with that, let's head over to the interview. Thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the episode. All right, I'm here with Dr. Philip John Paul Gonzales, who was the co-editor with Joseph Micah McMeans of the book Finitude's Wounded Praise, Responses to Jean-Louis Chrétien, who's the French phenomenological thinker. So Philip, thank you so much for coming on today, for coming on the Theology Mill. Really happy that we could have this conversation about your book. As we start, could you share with our listeners just a bit about yourself and your work?
Sure. Firstly, Zach, thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation today. So, just a little bit about my background. So, I completed my PhD in philosophy at the Catholic University of Louvain in 2015, under the supervision of Professor William Desmond and the co-supervision of Cyril O'Regan. After receiving my PhD, I took up a position at the University of Dallas, and I was there teaching at both their Dallas campus and their Rome campus. So from Rome, I then took a position as a lecturer in philosophy at St. Patrick's Pontifical University in Maynooth, Ireland, and I was there for 5 years, and I have just this year moved to St. Mary's Seminary and University in Baltimore, where I am an associate professor of philosophy, and next year I will be made full professor. So after 15 out of the last 17 years in Europe, I have, so to speak, come home to a place I've never been before, to quote John Denver. So it's good to be back in the States. And my work in general is on philosophical theology. And my first book was on the thought of the German Polish Jesuit Erich Przywara, entitled Reimagining the Analogia Entis, the future of Erich Przywara's Christian vision. And then with Whitfinstock, I have an edited volume on Cyril O'Regan entitled Exorcising Philosophical Modernity. And I'm very happy to have Finitude's Wounded Praise appear with you as well.
Yeah. Okay, I have a side question. The Catholic University of Louvain, forgive my ignorance, is that KU Leuven, or are those
Yes, it
two?
is. So,
Okay, okay.
it is. So the Flemish speaking, it broke in the 1960s. So historically, it was under the French title of Louvain, but now it is KU Leuven, which is the Flemish
Okay.
speaking way of saying it. And yes, yeah, it's the oldest
Okay.
Catholic university still in existence.
Wow, wow. Okay,
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Wow, yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so how did you discover Jean-Louis Chrétien? Like, what brought you to his work?
Well, actually, it was studying in Leuven. So I went there largely because I was interested both of returning to Europe and working under William Desmond. And so in Leuven, you have to do both a master's and an MPhil. And I did my master's on Hans Urs von Balthasar and Martin Heidegger. And then I moved on and I did my MPhil on Jean-Luc Marion. So it was through sort of Marion that I discovered the whole so-called theological turn in French phenomenology. So I started to read widely in those texts, Chrétien, Lacoste, Michel Henry, and of course Marion, and then later Emmanuel Falk. So I was when I first encountered. I think the first book I read. Trying to think the first book of Chrétien. I think it was The Arc of Speech, before Call and Response, actually. And the first time I read him, I was just struck by the extraordinary beauty of his prose and the unique singular style that he had amongst, again, the so-called thinkers of the theological turn, because he was very, very different from a Marion, an Henri, or Lacoste. Um, so yeah, he opened up a different world for me, and one in which I think I have a certain affinity towards.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. He's a bit hard to categorize, I think, which is
He is
something.
very hard to categorize.
Yeah, that's Graham Ward's chapter in your book, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But that's, yeah, his chapter on kind of trying to pin down how exactly do we categorize Chrétien, like what genre is he writing in, was really interesting. Okay, so before we get too far into Chrétien, though, let's do our icebreaker question. So if you could place any three people, dead or alive, and we can include Chrétien if you want to or not. I'll let you decide if you want to do that or not. But so you could do, if you want to do Chrétien, you could do Chrétien and then three additional ones or two additional ones, whichever works best for you. But if you could place these people kind of together in a room and listen in on their conversation, which people would you choose and why?
Okay, so a couple things to say in relation to this question. First of all, I think it's a great icebreaker, but I also have to confess that on another podcast that I had this question, but I'm very happy to answer it again. But I also have to confess that in my first answer, I cheated because I said that we have to bring in a fourth thinker into the conversation of the three. So if I'm allowed to do that,
Yes.
I'll rethink my initial answer to this question.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, okay. All right. So I would place Plato, Saint John the Evangelist, insofar as he's the great thinker of the incarnation, Hegel and Nietzsche into a room. And the reason I would do that is because you would sort of have the whole breadth of the drama of the Western tradition.
Mhm.
So with Plato, you have this extraordinary thinker of both logos and mythos, of philosophy and revelation, and this incredible balance between the two. So his philosophy is not self-standing; it's always in relation to some form of revelation. And there's certainly a reason that so many of the church fathers sort of saw him as a proto-Christian, and he became one of the primary figures that they were dialoguing with. So with Plato, you have sort of the inception of Western thought, of Western philosophy, and that delicate balance between reason and some form of religious revelation. You have his emphasis on philosophy as the practice of dying, which certainly in a Christian sense can kind of be proleptically read
Mhm.
as the great Johannine verse, unless a grain of wheat dies, it will not bear fruit.
Mm.
So that brings me then to the Christian interruption with the Johannine writings that just encapsulates in an extraordinary, exemplary fashion the mystery of the eruption that is the incarnation of the Word being made flesh as he enters into human history, and then this drama between light and darkness, which ensues. And so I think that you can see John as kind of the Analogia Princeps, the first an analogy of kind of all Christian thinking. There's a reason he's called the theologian.
Mhm.
Um, so Plato, his delicate balance between myth, revelation, and philosophy or reason, and then the incarnation within Saint John and the emphasis on the Word becoming flesh, and then with Hegel, the kind of the whole summation of the West, Western thought, and Christianity in particular. But we can't go off too much on Hegel because we would never talk about Chrétien.
Mhm.
However, he's a very, very complicated thinker, obviously one of the most brilliant, if not the most brilliant ever to write. But in my reading of him, he's very dangerous for Christianity because he sort of rewrites the Christian story in sort of almost modern myth where God has to become God in and through the working of time and history. He draws on the great Christian mysteries of the Trinity, on the incarnation, the mystical body, but yet he uses it as for a totally different reason. But his idea that philosophy has come to an end, history has come to an end. We're still trying to think what that means. It's provocative. I think in a sense he's right, in a sense he's wrong. But you get this incredible speculative machinery that shows sort of the whole drama of Western philosophy and then the singularity of Christianity, even if he's using Christianity ultimately in a deformed way, which I do think that he's doing. So then in a kind of post-Hegelian vein, you have all of this kind of summed up in the feverish intensity of the great Friedrich Nietzsche.
Mhm.
And in my mind, he's a deeply Christological thinker. Hegel's a Christological thinker in a way, but Nietzsche is also a Christological thinker insofar as he sees that the whole drama of history culminates in the antithesis between Christ, the crucified, and the Antichrist of Rome
Mhm.
versus Judea. So if you were to put Plato, you would have sort of the pagan pre-Christian beginnings of Western thought, and then the radical interruption of John, the thinker of the incarnation, of the fullness of what Christianity means and the Christian message, moving up with a conversation with Hegel in the picture about how
Mhm.
he's construing the whole history of philosophy and of Christianity in his own rendition of what he thinks that means. And then the madness, but I mean that as a compliment of
Mhm.
Nietzsche recognizing what history is about. So what that conversation would look like, well, nobody would know, and that's why I would want to put
Yeah.
those four in a room. It would be extraordinary.
Yeah. Wow, I think that's the most well thought out answer to that question that I've ever heard on the podcast, which is not a knock on other people who have given really good answers, but that was seriously impressive. Yeah, that would be a fascinating conversation. It'd be interesting to see if, like, any sort of teams or alliances would develop over the course of the conversation. Particularly with the two ancients and the two more modern figures. Okay, like you said, we could really get lost in talking about some of these figures, but I do want to make sure we get to Chrétien because we have a lot to talk about there as well. So there are a lot of really good chapter contributions in here. I mean, they're all really good, but there are several contributions in here, and I just for the sake of kind of focusing our conversation, maybe we'll kind of key in on a couple different chapters, and then we'll talk a bit about your introduction as well. So kind of to kick things off, I want to talk about Christina Geschwantner's chapter in here. In that chapter, she's kind of considering Chrétien as this thinker of like precarity. And so she's looking at kind of the use of words like vulnerability, fragility, nudity, and kind of the role these words play throughout the body of his writing. So she's doing almost this kind of like intellectual history of Chrétien's project with regards to these sort of similar words, kind of all the way from early on in his work to his final published book, which is on fragility. So I'm wondering for our listeners if you might say a bit about in what ways Chrétien is a thinker of precarity.
Okay. Yes. So I mean, Christina's contribution is simply wonderful. It's a very detailed, as you've already kind of said, analysis of picking out this theme from the very early Chrétien on his text on the nakedness of the voice to his very last text on fragility, which is I think it's symbolic that his last text was on fragility because it is arguably the thread that runs throughout all of his work. Of course, the title of the edited volume is Finitude's Wounded Praise, which of course resonates very much with the intention of Christina's chapter. So how is Chrétien a thinker of fragility, vulnerability, nudity? All of this is an excellent question that gets really to the core of what he's trying to show us. And I'm going to try to give during our conversation, I'm going to try to give the bigger picture about Chrétien in relation to the questions that you have on the particular chapters, so that then the audience, hopefully, and then people that are going to read the book can go into greater detail. So in some sense, I'm going to simplify Chrétien's thinking as a point of departure, a point of entrance into trying to understand the very intricate, delicate, finessed poetic modality that he thinks within and through. Okay, so one of the ways to try to understand why he's a thinker of these sort of themes of precarity, fragility, so on and so forth, is that he certainly is pushing back against philosophical modernity's foundationalism and its stress on radical autonomy, from the Cartesian cogito up through German idealism or the heroic Übermensch of Nietzsche. He's trying to show us that what we are, down to every single fiber and vibration of our very being, are beings which are open to the whole, open to the world, to creation, to other humans, to all living beings, to works of art, poetry, music. In other words, that we are open before we can ever be open towards something. So our very nature is to be open. So you have the vision of, he uses the wound, right? A wound is something which we usually consider to be open, an open wound. So it's this idea that we are completely relational, and there's no way to understand ourselves but in relation to others. To be is to be in relation, inter esse or co-esse, to use more Latin terms. So Chrétien is also trying to So when we hear the term wound and we hear the term vulnerability, we often have negative connotations of those kinds of words, and rightfully and wrongfully so, I think. So Chrétien is trying to think at all the different levels of what it might be to be wounded, what it might be to be vulnerable, and so that there can be both positive and negative senses in which this is the case. But really, what he's trying to do is, I think, trying to bring out how this is a positive aspect of our humanity, or if we want to raise it to more theological language, creatureliness, or if we want to stick on a more philosophical plane, finitude. So Chrétien is a thinker of finitude. He's a thinker of what it means to be finite, what it means to be limited, and how it constitutes our very relation to everything, to the whole of being. So it's and what he does. I mean, I think we're going to get into this with some of the later questions, I would imagine. So I don't know how much I want to go into it here, but what he does is he performs this in his style of thinking, trying to show us how to be open to all of these different aspects of our being as a means of welcoming otherness within us, without
Mm-hmm.
which, Paul Ricoeur wrote the text oneself as another, but Ricoeur had this idea of a kind of wounded cogito, but he didn't want to fully let go of the cogito, but he wanted to wound it. So it's this movement between a strong and a weak modernity in Ricoeur. Well, Chrétien completely wants to show that there's no cogito, and what we are is a wound, a positive wound to open ourselves towards that which is not ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautifully put. So is there kind of a relationship between when we're talking about, fragility, wounds, especially wound, right, as a very physical image. So is there a relationship between sort of physical fragility on the one hand and moral fragility in Chrétien's thinking?
It's a very good question. Yeah, absolutely, yes. So Chrétien is a thinker of the wholeness of what we are, as incarnate beings, as existing within time, and becoming ourselves through our actions and what we do. So to think the meaning of the body is to think the meaning of, if we want to use the language soul here, you cannot think the two separately. And so to think what it means to be an incarnate being is also going to be the grounds upon which we think about the more moral dimensions of opening ourselves to the other in a kind of Levinasian sense of hospitality. And so to be wounded, we're wounded all the way through, in the sense that we're called to respond. So his famous, right, call and response. We are always already called before we respond. So whenever we are responding to any sort of wound, bodily or spiritual or moral, it's in response to that which is beyond us, which is other to us. So this idea again that with Chrétien, we're always already late,
Mm-hmm.
where we are in essence response.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So if I'm hearing you correctly, like, and based on kind of, the little bit of reading of Chrétien I've done myself, does he kind of it seems like he kind of sees woundedness and fragility as, like you said, opening us up to the other, but almost kind of like enabling this greater kind of hospitality towards others, or the greater kind of listening capacities towards others, or something like that. First of all, like how does Chrétien sort of describe that process, and does one's own kind of woundedness and fragility have something to do with the other's wounds and fragility, or is it just that it sort of opens one up to another more generally? Like how would Chrétien sort of describe that?
Yeah. So another excellent question. So I mean, I think we have to go back to this kind of this, once again, the idea of the call, and the response. And so what he's trying to, and this is gonna, what he's ultimately trying to show is that the kind of philosophy that he's trying to perform is a spiritual practice. So what he's trying to do is teach us how to be attentive to the phenomenon of the call and all of the different ways that he may discuss it. But the central idea is that there has to be this kind of active passivity. So it's kind of a paradox. If you're passive, you're not active. If you're active, you're not passive. But you can't place it in that kind of neat categories. When you're open, there's when you're trying to be receptive and open to that which is not distinctly yours, then there has to be this emphasis upon the activity of opening oneself. So the call, no doubt, makes that possible. The call is always anterior to the response, but in order for the call to penetrate what we are, to see ourselves precisely as response, we ourselves have to respond. So this is a means of communication. It's a means of tying, if we want to think on interpersonal relations, which is perhaps the most experientially obvious, then it's a means of bringing us together through this, through our passive receptivity, which is again active. We have to open ourselves to heeding the call of that which is not ourselves. And in terms of wound and other people's woundedness, I think he's sort of saying that our wounds are what make us singular. So I'm pretty sure, I may be wrong about this. I think in one of his texts, he talks about the scar of Odysseus being recognized by the maidservant. And he talks about the wounds of Christ through which Thomas recognizes that it's Christ. So it is through our wounds that our singularity emerges, but also our communion and recognition of others, and thus the ability to be able to dialogue and converse, and to have human relations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, kind of jumping ahead to Graham Ward's chapter, which I mentioned just briefly earlier. Right? So he opens this chapter with just this short question: what is the genre in which Jean-Louis Chrétien writes? And then he sort of makes his case for reading Chrétien as kind of a mystagogy for today. That's how he would kind of describe the category, I guess, the genre of Chrétien's writing. So what's kind of Ward's case for reading Chrétien in this way? And then maybe taking a step back in case any of our listeners are not familiar, or in case it's just helpful for kind of contextualizing Chrétien. What exact or how exactly would you kind of describe? I know this is a big question, but
Mhm.
maybe just basic nuts and bolts. How would you describe this tradition of kind of mystagogy that Ward is trying to place Chrétien within?
Okay. Yes, that's a big question. So if I miss any parts of it, then please feel free to come back and
Okay.
demand that I answer them. All right.
Okay,
Um,
sounds good.
s- um, so let me first say two things. One in relation to the overall scope of Graham's essay, and then second, I'll give sort of the historical grounds of mystagogy. Um, so the first is that Graham's essay it's absolute tour de force. He's bringing in so many different sources, so many different lines of thinking to try to make a very, very compelling argument that this is how we should understand and read Chrétien, and it's certainly one that I'm very sympathetic to. So it would be impossible here to go into the depths of his very, very wonderful essay. So this is why you need to read it, and I'm not just saying that
Hmm.
to sell a book,
Hmm.
but everybody should read this essay. It's absolutely wonderful. So, but I will try to give, like you said, the nuts and bolts of what Graham's getting at in his essay. But first, let's go back to what I said. Secondly, of sort of the historical, and then we'll just do this very, very broadly. So he's appealing to the Christian tradition of mystagogy, which arose in the late fourth century. amongst Christian thinkers. And the idea was that these were post-Easter homilies, after the catechumens had been received into the church on Easter. And so this was kind of a second level of initiation or instruction into the meaning of Christianity, whereas the first stage for the catechumens focused more on the creedal understanding of Christianity. The second stage after their baptism and the post-Easter homilies of it was meant for the whole church, but of course the church has just received in new members. So it focused largely on the sacraments and sacramentality, especially the Eucharist and baptism. And it's meant to show that doctrine is not just doctrine in the sense of something that you think or that you hold, but that doctrine is something that you have to absolutely put into practice. So it was emphasizing more practical liturgical modes of understanding Christianity as something that you do. And so in Graham's essay, he's very much wanting to emphasize that the ultimate meaning of this is following Christ, who is the way. So the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, that we have to live and do and enact what it is that we actually believe and hold in a more creedal, abstract way. So later on, Maximus the Confessor, representative of more Eastern thought, would write a book called Mystagogy, or a part of a book on it. And then in the Latin tradition, this kind of came to be known as manduction, so a leading by hand. And you can see representatives of this in figures like John Scotus Eriugena, and then perhaps arguably maybe the greatest representation in Hugh of St. Victor in the Middle Ages. So both the East and the West had aspects of this mystagogy, but they emphasize slightly different aspects. So with Graham's essay, he's wanting to say that Chrétien belongs to this broadly speaking Christian tradition, insofar as he's trying to lead us into the mysteries. So there's so that you can kind of see his argument. There's sort of three different prongs on which he's trying to show this, and one is he's trying to say that Chrétien is writing out of a tradition that is well known within France, and that is the tradition of the Meditations. So you have the Meditations of Descartes, you have the Pensées of Pascal, you have Montaigne. And then in the 20th century, uh, uh, Gaston Bachelard and Lucula Barthes. And so he's saying that the Chrétien is part of this French tradition, okay, which does have a huge emphasis on the meditative. And so we should be viewing Chrétien's work within this francophone sense. But then, of course, that French tradition is going to obviously be connected in different ways and to greater or lesser degrees to the Christian tradition of mystagogy. So he's saying that, and then he's also saying that the very thrust of phenomenology is ultimately for it to be a spiritual practice. Um, and so Chrétien is taking us back to the reality that phenomenology, that philosophy is a spiritual practice. It's a way of pedagogy. It is teaching us how to be formed properly in an attentive understanding of what reality is. And we're back to the call, the response, the openness, the vulnerability, all of these things. So he's playing with so much within the essay itself. Like I said, these sort of three traditions: the French tradition of the Meditations, the Christian mystagogical tradition, and then the idea that really what phenomenology is meaning in its very essence is ultimately that it is an openness, it's a spiritual practice. And so to fully understand Chrétien's work, we have to understand that when we read him, we are reading along with his meditations. It's evocative. We're being carried into this meditative space where Chrétien orchestrates all of these different voices of the traditions that are all in some way going to be gathered together in trying to teach us again, and to be attentive to how things show themselves. And
Mm-hmm.
so phenomenology is returned to the fact that it is meant to manifest and show. And the way in
Mm-hmm.
which Chrétien manifests and shows ultimately is the performativity of his style of thinking, which we have to enter into and participate in. It doesn't make sense just to read the Confessions, to read Descartes' Meditations. You actually have to try and enact what it is that Augustine is doing, what it is
Mm-hmm.
that Descartes is doing. It's not just a pure syllogism. And so
Mm-hmm.
Chrétien is taking us back to this kind of way of trying to do philosophy differently.
Yeah, no, I think you're already starting to answer the next question a bit, right? Which has to do with this kind of relationship between phenomenology and mystagogy that you're getting into already. And then we see that kind of playing out in a particular way with Chrétien. And it kind of makes sense, like phenomenology, like you were saying, right? It's this patient or even kind of contemplative sort of description of phenomena or of what appears, what manifests, what shows itself. So maybe, as a next question, maybe where do you see kind of resonances between these two traditions, right? Between mystagogy on the one hand and phenomenology on the other. Where are you kind of seeing those at work in Chrétien's writing?
Yeah, so it's ultimately in the sense that so you have in phenomenology the technical term reduction, but this comes from the Latin reductio, which means to be led into. So mystagogy is a leading into the Christian mysteries. It's a leading into being taken up by and then enacting in one's life the truth of those mysteries. So he's Chrétien is, and here I think Graham is correct in his essay. Chrétien recognizes that this is also what phenomenology is ultimately meant to do. It is to be a reductio in mysterium, leading into the mysteries. And the reductio in mysterium is actually a phrase from Erich Przywara, whom I wrote my first book on.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, he
Mm-hmm.
was in dialogue with Husserl, with Scheler, with Heidegger, and Edith Stein in the early phenomenological tradition. So it is this idea that phenomenology is to lead us into the mysteries of that which is the invisible within the visible, um,
Mm-hmm.
and all of the intricacies of so many diverse phenomena. So that's how you can see these kind of two strands of mystagogy and phenomenology, both of which are intending to lead one into the mysteries. One is explicitly of Christian reality, and then the other into all of the different aspects of reality, which we don't necessarily have to invoke revelation to see the mystery of aspects of what we would say in a Christian way, God's creation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Does,
yeah,
does that
absolutely.
help?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, definitely helps. So, yeah, would it be? Do you think it'd be accurate to? And I know somebody has described Chrétien's writings this way, and I can't remember who it was, or if it was in this book or elsewhere. I can't remember, but I know somebody has referred to Chrétien's work as kind of a phenomenology of prayer. Do you think it's accurate to describe it this way?
Yes, and it's slipping my mind where that actually. I mean, he has a text on phenomenology and prayer, but so it is definitely a phenomenology of prayer, but it's not just a kind of neutral phenomenological description. I mean, he'll get into prayer as speech acts and so on and so forth, and he will give what you could kind of say is more neutral phenomenological descriptions. But it's the idea that I think what he's doing ultimately with his kind of thinking is it is a thinking which is praying. So you enter into the movement of Chrétien's thought, which is itself already this kind of prayerful, attentive atmosphere to all the ways in which reality and ultimately the divine gives itself to the human. So once again, you have to stress the fact that Chrétien is performative. He's doing what he's saying. He's not just describing things. He's performing what he's describing, or he's describing in performing. So in that sense, it is a prayer, but I think you can make the comparison to the Confessions of Augustine. In Latin, confessio is to speak with. So when you enter into Augustine's Confessions, what you realize is that he's speaking first to God. It's a conversation between him and God, and then through this conversation to his readers. So he's speaking with, and he's inviting us into this incredible conversation that he's having with the Christian God about all of the aspects of his life and how he's trying to think these through in his current state. Something analogous is going on in Chrétien. If it's a phenomenology of prayer, it's a phenomenology of prayer which asks us to enter into this atmosphere with Chrétien, to pray with Chrétien, to pray alongside Chrétien in the same way that Augustine, I think, is asking us to do the same. That's why the Confessions is every man's story, or every woman's story. It's a story of humanity. And so there's something universal in this conversation that Augustine, the singular Augustine, is having with God. And Chrétien is very much in touch with this deep Augustinian tradition. And at the end of the day, I mean, he is an Augustinian thinker. He is a neo-Augustinian that is reawakening this sort of spirit within the contemporary world.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really great way to put it. Yeah, no, it's like his work on call and response, if I'm hearing you correctly, and just his work in general is itself kind of a call for our response as readers, right? For a call to sort of participate in what he's up to. I want to jump back to your introduction, which was really helpful for me, just kind of opening up Chrétien's thinking. So one thing you say in there is that for Chrétien, and kind of borrowing from Balthasar, the truth of others is symphonic, or better, polyphonic. So what does that mean for Chrétien, right? That otherness is sort of polyphonic. What do we mean by otherness there? And in what ways is that otherness kind of polyphonic as you describe it?
Okay. What you get with Chrétien, again, which kind of establishes his uniqueness, at least with or amongst the voices of the theological turn, is that when you read his text, he is drawing from theological sources, and these don't have to be explicitly Christian; they can be Islamic and other uh, uh, Judaism, so on and so forth. He's drawing from a deep wealth of religious traditions, although he prioritizes Christianity. The other religions are not absent. He draws on music, the fine arts. He draws on poetry, novels, philosophers. So he's drawing this whole breadth and this expanse of all of these ways in which we can be open to the mystery of reality, the mystery of things which enter into us from the outside, things which are not ourselves. So whether, again, it's theological, philosophical, literary, poetic, artistic, he's showing how we are open, or how we should be open to all of these realities. So in this sense, it's not just about a strictly philosophical discourse or theological discourse or philosophical otherness, theological otherness, but about orchestrating all of these various forms of otherness, and how we should be attentive, listening, and how we should be led, as in the beautiful text, hand to hand, listening to the work of art. So we should be led into this listening to the work of art. If I recall correctly, in that text, he draws on Paul Claudel's beautiful title of his book on Flemish painting, which the title of the book is "The Eye Listens." The eye listens. So it's not just he's trying to show how we need to be open to reality in all of these various dimensions, and not only that, but how our senses are mingled. They're synesthetic. We hear when we see when we hear, when we touch. All of these have to be mingled together. So ears can see and the eye can listen. So it's extraordinary, all the different depths in which he's playing with this. So that's in a nutshell what I mean by polyphonic. I mean, he's enacting a polyphony, a play of all these different voices on different notes and levels.
Yeah, no, thank you for that clarification. That's very helpful. Okay, so another topic you read about in your introduction is gratitude and the kind of the place of gratitude in Chrétien's thought. So, what is the importance of gratitude in Chrétien's thinking?
I mean, I think it's utterly central. So he says the only phenomenological access that we have to the gift is in a thank you of gratitude. And so we cannot really understand when we're receiving all of these various forms of otherness, whether it's the mystery of literature, of poetry, of philosophy, of theology, of human beings, or the glory of the world or of God's creation. The way in which we are meant to respond is precisely through gratitude. That's where the call is really heard. It's in the response of gratitude that we know that we have heard the call. So he's getting at something very, very profound. And so I think that he takes very serious the tragic elements in human existence. I don't want to downplay that at all. But what he's ultimately showing is that we have to see how when we receive these things, we're receiving a gift, and a gift is received ultimately in the response of gratitude. He says of a thank you. So Heidegger famously says, the later Heidegger says that thinking is thanking. So, but Chrétien is taking this in a much deeper sense, because Heidegger's going to not let us be able to say thank you for a lot of things, because he methodologically restricts them in his philosophical discourse. Whereas Chrétien is opening, it is an expansive opening of philosophical thought to all of its others, and the ability to receive this in an act of gratitude shows that we have really understood what has shown itself and what has given itself to us. So I think, in a nutshell, gratitude really encapsulates what he's trying to perform when he's trying to take us into the deep depths of the mystery of reality in all of these various dimensions. Again,
Mm-hmm. So would you say that he sort of refuses to kind of play by the rules of modern philosophy, like, because it seems like some of the other figures in phenomenology maybe are more in the habit of kind of tarrying at the boundaries between like philosophy and theology, for instance. Whereas with Chrétien, it seems like there's more of a kind of shirking of that sort of atheist reduction you're talking about. Do you think that he just sort of dismisses or just kind of passes through that sort of frame for doing philosophy?
I mean, he's definitely countering, yes, an atheistic reduction, whether it's Heidegger or in certain representatives of French postmodernism, and he's also, in my view, and I mean, this is where Chrétien is just so hard uh, to pin down. I mean, he's blurring the lines of everything.
Hmm.
I think he still is doing a kind of phenomenology, but it's what he's doing is not reducible simply to phenomenology. He's out of the Catholic French phenomenologists, contemporary ones, or the ones with the theological turn. I mean, his understanding of the entire tradition, Neoplatonism, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, the Church Fathers, and then the whole history of philosophy, and not only that, but poetry, literature, art, photography, the
Yeah.
fine arts,
Yeah.
sculpture, everything. So he's doing his own thing. There's precedent for what he's doing. He's not the only one that's ever done something like this, but he's blurring a lot of lines, and that really does make him very, very unique amongst French phenomenologists. And I may be wrong in this, but I do think he's less concerned than a Marion to really safeguard those strict borders of
Yeah.
phenomenology and
Yeah.
theology, where Marion
Yeah.
almost gets obsessed with it.
Hmm.
Chrétien's he's not worried about that. He's performing what he's going to do, and if you're going to understand what he's doing, then you have to kind of go along with him to see what he's doing.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, yeah, super appreciate your time and your extremely thoughtful answers today. As we kind of wrap things up here, I want to give you the chance to share about anything you're working on next. What's next for you? Do you have any kind of work in progress or anything else that you'd like to plug here?
Okay, thank you, Zach. So I just finished a book, my second monograph. I have edited volumes, but my second monograph, and this text it's just been submitted. It's entitled "Prologue to a Metaphysics of Patmos." Patmos being allusion to the island where Saint John, where the tradition says that Saint John received the revelation of the apocalypse.
Mm-hmm.
So this was the fruit of before I came to St. Mary's. I was on a 2-year research grant that I received from St. Andrews, which was part of a £2 million Templeton grant given by Templeton Religion Trust. And this grant was spearheaded and run by Professor Judith Wolfe in St. Andrews. So this was the first Templeton grant in continental philosophy. So it was a bit
Mm-hmm.
of a milestone. And before that, all of their grants were in analytic philosophy. So there were 12 grants given from the umbrella grant, and I received one of the 12. So
Mm-hmm.
during those last 2 years, I wrote this book called Prologue to Metaphysics of Patmos, and it will take us too far afield to go into exactly what that means, but it's
Sure.
the prologue to a trilogy that I'm planning that will then also have an epilogue. So in total, it will be 5 volumes.
Mm, okay.
Um, but in a very, very quick nutshell, otherwise we'll be here all day, and I don't want to bore anybody. In a nutshell, Prologue to Metaphysics of Patmos is a kind of imaginative, philosophical, theological thought project,
Mhm,
which asks ourselves, what if Christian thinking were living in those biblical times foretold in the New Testament? What if Christian thought was thinking within those times where Christ says, "When I come back, will I find faith on earth?" If it is possible, even the elect will be deceived. I have to shorten the days so that for the sake of the elect. So these very strange passages that we get from Christ in the so-called little apocalypses of the Synoptic Gospels.
mm,
So this text is trying to imagine, what if Christian thinking was living in this time of eschatological urgency?
mm,
Well,
mhm,
what would it think? What would it prize as most precious to the essence of Christianity? And my answer is that Christianity would we would have to, it would be a reductio, again, to draw on the conversation that we had today. It would be a reductio in mysterium, a leading into the mysteries of the Christological truth of Christianity, that would then open into the Trinitarian depths of Christianity.
Mhm.
So it's establishing, or it's trying to think through a Christological metaphysics that opens into what I term a metaphysics of Trinitarian response. And to use the resources that I'm using is very much the analogical tradition post Przywara, but it's a constructive project, so it's not drawing on any one thinker. Um,
Mhm. Mhm.
and then I'm trying to see what this means, that Christianity is itself Christological and Trinitarian, and then the urgency to then act this truth out in active love, the doing of love. So the style is very, very broadly speaking Johannine, in the sense that it's trying to dwell in the mystery that God is love, and that we only know fully this love of God, this God who is love, in the active doing of love. So it's a dramatic form of sort of doing Christian metaphysics that is trying to say what at the end of the day are the metaphysical treasures of
Mhm.
Christianity,
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
and how could we think them if time is running out, so to speak.
Mhm.
There's a lot more
Mhm.
to be said, but
Yeah,
that's
no, I'm sure. No, it sounds fascinating. Yeah, I'm curious. Are you interfacing with like John Bear's work at all in that project? Just I'm
um,
thinking of sort of his stuff on the prologue of John, and even some of the things you were saying kind of brought to mind some of his work.
yes, of course. So his recent book on John the theologian is fantastic. I'm not sure I agree with everything in it, but we're not going to
Sure,
go there right
sure.
now.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
but so indirectly, yes, because I deal with Michel Henry, and John
Mhm.
Bear, of course, ends that text in a dialogue with Michel Henry.
Mhm.
And Michel Henry's project is his last three works are a Johannine trilogy. So
Right.
certainly within continental philosophy, the at least on a formal level, what I'm doing would be most similar with Michel Henry, but I actually very much disagree with how Henry approaches things. So
Mhm.
I do try
Mhm.
to differentiate that, but insofar as both are kind of trying to think John and the writings of Saint John in a contemporary constructive context, then
Mhm.
um,
Mhm.
then yes. So I didn't get into John Bear's book very much, but it is indirectly there in my
Sure,
5 or 6
sure.
pages in which I deal with Henri.
Yeah, 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 sure, sure. No, yeah, it sounds like a fascinating project. I'll be excited to see this first of the volumes go to press. Philip, thank you so much for taking the time. Like I said, really, really enjoyed our conversation. I appreciate your very thoughtful answers and taking some time out of your day.
Zach, thank you for inviting me. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed the conversation immensely, and thank you.